Then I guess we can start for today's session. Welcome everyone. Happy to see you all. Today we have two interesting talks about Hyperloop, more specifically socioeconomics and sustainability in Hyperloop. Today, accompanying us, we have Hugo Albert from UPV Valencia, who has been doing an amazing job over there last year in the European Hyperloop Week and wrote a successful report on economical studies. And then we have also an interesting talk about the colleagues from Queen's Hyperloop design team in Canada, from which we will be hearing more in depth afterwards. So with this, I would like to introduce the first talk of today. As mentioned before, with us, Hugo Albert, former team captain, a technical director at Hyperloop UPV, and he will be talking about his report on the topic AI-based analysis of the public discourse of Hyperloop and guidelines for optimal divulgation. So with this said, Hugo, I will leave the floor to you, and thanks a lot for joining today.
Okay, so thank you so much, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen for all of you to be able to follow the presentation better. So
we can see it.
Perfect then. So yeah, as Daniel said, I was part of Hyperloop UPV last year. We developed this research about how to orient the divulgation of Hyperloop based on an analysis with artificial intelligence. And just to start to show our motivation, this is more or less the shape of the process of divulgation of an innovation. It starts really slow, then it experiences a takeoff, and once it reaches the 30% of acceptance, it's theoretically unstoppable, which means that it's going to be implemented in reality. However, Hyperloop experienced a different type of curve. When growing, it started from a highly mediatic person, as it's Elon Musk, of course, and the newspapers expected a lot from it. They thought it was going to be a revolution and it was going to be implemented in a short period of time. But the reality is that Hyperloop relies on really complex technology that needs to be developed with standardizations and step by step. So once the news that we're expecting a lot from it noticed that it was really slow and there were periods with no advances at all, then the result was a huge wave of negative news outlets about Hyperloop. And of course, for us as a Hyperloop team, it affected a lot the way we communicated with the audience, the way we tried to share the knowledge of Hyperloop with the general public, and of course the way we contacted sponsors, for example, which is the main force that moves our team. So with that in mind, we had an objective that was to change our communication strategy in order to reach the audience that we wanted, to arrive to the general public in a better way. And we discovered that there were two main links that connected us with our audience, that were news outlets and social media. That means that we can focus on what we are saying and what is the message that we want to send, but that message is going to be interpreted by those links, and they are going to transform it. So the message that the audience is going to receive is going to be different. And we don't have to focus just on what we are saying and what we want them to receive, but how we have to say it in order to for them to receive faithful information. So, well, the research also had some limitations, of course. We are Spanish, we have always a budget limitation. So we couldn't rely on APIs like Twitter, for example. We had to focus on public free data. We also limited the research to a content analysis, which means that we are going to analyze what's said, how it is said, and how often it is said, but we are not taking into account some aspects like the profile of the author or the engagement that it's producing. And also we had a limitation in terms of temporal perspective. More or less every new related to Hyperloop is from 2 years ago or less. So we didn't have that perspective in order to compare the evolution of the content. So of course, data extraction is a crucial aspect of every research. We extracted every single piece of new that appears when you search for the word Hyperloop in both Google and Bing, and also all the transcriptions from YouTube videos that appear when you search for the same word. And then we incorporated a new data set that comes from a really renowned researcher in terms of argumentation. So it helped us distinguish if a sentence is an argument in favor, against, or it's not an argument related to a certain topic. Then we extracted also TikTok videos and Reddit comments, but we analyzed them and we realized they lack argumentation, so they were not useful for us. But if you contact the team, I'm sure they would be glad to share it with you if you want to continue with a similar research where it's more useful. So our methodology starts with the creation of a neural network because we had hundreds or thousands of news outlets and YouTube videos, and we wanted to analyze all of them, extract the arguments, and perform a deep analysis of it. So we could hire an army of people that would be reading all of them day and night, or we could automate the process using a neural network. So of course, the second one sounded better. And here's the overview of the neural network that we developed. For those who aren't familiar with it, I'm going to explain it step by step. But the main idea is that it receives a sentence and it says it returns the probability of it being an argument against, in favor of Hyperloop, or not an argument. First, it starts with Roberta Large encoder for text, which receives a sentence and returns a matrix of values between 0 and 1. That matrix contains the same number of rows as the number of tokens in the sentence, which is essentially words and punctuation marks, and then a column for each dimension of the vector. So each row is a vector that tries to express the meaning of the sentence in a mathematical way, which means that it's locating the word in a multidimensional space. It's called word embedding, and for you to understand it better, here there's an example with 3 dimensions, as every person is able to see. If you take the vector that points to the word man and the vector that points to the word woman, and you subtract them, you have another vector that contains the meaning of more or less what could be femininity. So if you add it to the word king, for example, you get a position in the space that is really, really close to the word queen. And that's amazing because that means that you are being able to understand mathematically the meaning of the words. However, those are called uncontextual embeddings, which means that they don't take into account if, for example, the word bank is the bank of the river or the financial institution. And we are using another type of word embeddings that are called contextual embeddings that take into account the rest of the words in the sentence. So you achieve greater results. Then we use convolutional neural networks that are often used for image analysis. And that could sound a bit controversial because we are analyzing text, but not images. But the truth is that we have a matrix with values between 0 and 1 that could be interpreted as the level of gray of an image. So if you use it for each cell of the matrix, you achieve something that could be like a black and white image that, of course, for us as humans wouldn't have any meaning. But for machines, it works pretty good and it gave us really good results. And then typical feed-forward network, which is the typical neural network that you'll see everywhere draw. So it has some multiplications, some non-linear functions, and then it returns 3 probabilities: the probability of it being an argument against Hyperloop, in favor of it, or not an argument at all. Then we had to compare it with the state of the art of the moment, which was GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4. GPT-4o, yeah, and O1 didn't exist, which would be interesting to compare with. But we realized that our model was the best one for our task because they perform really similar, and ours maintain literality, which is a crucial aspect in terms of linguistics and marketing and sociology. As maybe you can picture that there are some plays on words or some sarcasm that you want to reproduce when you are communicating. So we decided to continue with it. Then we had to extract every argument from the documents. So we iterated through all of them. We separated each document into sentences, and we classified each of them between arguments against, in favor, or not arguments. Then we removed the ones that were not arguments, and we performed a series of steps that were emotions analysis, clustering, word frequency analysis, and a combination of all of them. So first, why emotions analysis? I'm not sure if you've seen lots of politicians discussing different topics, but they always try to reach your subconscious self by expressing lots of emotions and trying to transmit them. So that is the main concept that is going to decide for you when there are not enough rational elements or reasons that you can focus on in order to make a decision. So it's really important to understand which emotions are those arguments trying to transmit. Well, that's just a technicality. We performed some tests to distinguish which were the emotions that had the biggest difference between arguments in favor or against Hyperloop. And those emotions resulted to be disapproval, anger, fear, approval, sadness, and disappointment. And those are plotted here in a 2D plot in order to make it easier. But the essential information that you can see here is that approval, sadness, and disappointment go always together or usually together, while disapproval goes on the contrary. And then anger and fear are also linked together, but independent to the other emotions. Then we performed clustering analysis, which is an algorithm that creates different groups inside a set of observations. The problem is that you don't know which criteria it is following. So it works like if I tell you, come here to my room and you have to create different groups of my objects. And maybe you decide that you are going to separate them based on size or based on color. So then when I arrive here and I see the different objects, I have to analyze which criteria you followed in order to understand why you separated it like that. So in order to know the criteria that our algorithm followed to create the groups, we performed a word frequency analysis, which are some plots that show us the words with the highest frequency in each group. It's the same as saying the words that are mostly repeated in them. So for example, here we have a group of arguments in favor of Hyperloop, and we have here the words energy, emission, sustainable, which means that this group is in favor of Hyperloop because they are expressing the benefits that Hyperloop brings to the environment. And then we have another group that is against Hyperloop that contains the words Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, Boring Company, or what is the same, they are against Hyperloop because of the eccentricity of Elon Musk. Then we combine every aspect together, and those plots can be, again, a bit tricky to understand, but you have to focus on the peaks. Here we have a peak for group 5 that expresses more amusement than the rest of them. So just an example. And what happens when we combine everything together in order to draw some conclusions? First, we compared different groups, and we saw that those groups, for example, express the same words, but one is in favor of Hyperloop and the other one is against Hyperloop. So how can it be possible that the same idea appears as an argument against and in favor of it? Here we have some examples. The first one in favor of Hyperloop is expressing how vacuum tunnels can eliminate the resistance to enhance the speed and conserve energy, while the other one is concerned about if it's suitable for all the ages. If we analyze the plots that I showed before, here for news in favor, we can see that group 3 has a peak for gratitude and relief. But the most interesting thing is that for the arguments against Hyperloop, group 5, which was the one with the same words, has a peak for disgust, nervousness, and the leading emotion is fear, which means that fear is what is turning a positive aspect into a negative one, because it's difficult to understand. And when we don't understand something, we think that's a threat. So that's something to take in, to keep in mind. Then we saw another group that contained words like minute, kilometer, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Barcelona, Madrid, which expressed trips that were familiar for people in terms of the same time, but expressed with Hyperloop. For example, from Valencia to Madrid in 30 minutes. That's something that's really important because they start to see it like something quotidian, something from their daily life, and they can picture better the benefits that they would experience. And another one pretty similar, it contained the words train, maglev, bullet train, faster, traditional. Again, Hyperloop is being compared to other means of transportation in this case, which is approaching it to the general public. And we have to take into account, of course, the difference between platforms. In news, all the arguments are more neutral, and therefore it's more important to distinguish the underlying emotions, while YouTube videos are polarized and targeted for young people. So just as a conclusion, that was the process that we followed. We detected an initial objective, we collected the data, we analyzed it, and we draw some conclusions, which are that you have to take into account the audience that you want to reach, because it's not the same if you want to reach to arrive to young people, where YouTube videos are going to be more useful, or to the general public, where news outlets are more interesting. But also that you have to take into account if you want to attract any type of attention. Therefore, maybe you can talk about Elon Musk because it draws a lot of negative attention. But if you want to focus on positive aspects or positive attention, even if you don't reach, if you don't arrive to so many people, maybe we have to start to forget about talking about him. And then you have to consider the interests of the people. There are some topics that are clearly in the positive argumentation of Hyperloop, and some topics that are clearly in the negative one, in the negative side, and others that are in the middle, that are sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So we have to understand when it's positive and when not. For example, it's usually negative when it comes to fear and confusion. So there's when perspective is really important, because you have to approach it to them, you have to compare it with familiar examples so that they can picture how it's going to affect them, and they have to understand that the benefits are going to be really more important than the risks. And just to finish, saying that our model is public on Hugging Face, and the arguments, the news, the TikTok videos and Reddit posts, as I said, everything that we've extracted is not public, but I'm sure that if you want to continue with a similar research, you can contact the team and they would be glad to share it with you. So thank you so much. That's all for the presentation. If anyone has any question, I'll be glad to answer.
Thanks, Hugo. In fact, we have some questions too already. The first one, what specific comparisons have been shown to be effective in reframing concerns about cost or safety?
About costs? Well, there's a problem because people is not aware of how much a train costs, for example. So again, comparing with other means of transportations, especially the subway or the regular train, it's going to be really useful, because I'm not sure if they would understand the comparison with the maglev or the bullet train.
What about safety? Do you have any comments?
Yeah, about safety, we discovered that the most important thing is to express complex concepts in a simple way, so that they don't fear the unknown. They have to understand it so that they can comprehend why it's not dangerous.
Yeah, fear unknown.
Mhm.
Makes sense. The second question is, what types of messages were most effective in helping the public feel safe about Hyperloop? You already partially answered, but feel free to add your comments.
Well, I just want to point that we analyzed what the arguments were expressing, but we don't have certainty about how people are feeling after reading them. But yeah, as I said, the journalists expressed fear when they talked about technology that they didn't understand, because there was not a valid, rational reason that they were expressing on those arguments. It was just emotional.
Okay, thank you. And we have two more questions too. The third one, are there any key adjustments that would be needed to adapt this communication approach outside of the Western audiences?
Sorry, it froze. Could you repeat, please?
Are there any key adjustments that would be needed to adapt this communication approach outside of the Western audience? Outside
Yeah.
the
No, I would say that we extracted the news from Switzerland, the USA, the Netherlands, I think also Spain. So I'm not sure if we selected news from Asia, because we wanted to focus on English and Spanish, but I would say it's pretty international. The results are pretty international.
Okay, I mean Europe.
Yeah, Europe and America. Yeah.
Okay. Last one. Great research, Hugo. Did you or the team plot a comparative graph to your first slide on innovation adaptation, specific to Hyperloop, after you have collected and analyzed the results? Do you have any graph about your results? And the second question followingly, based on your findings, are there other specific angles of messaging that can have more positive reactions to Hyperloop?
Okay, so I'm not sure what they mean with the graphs about the results. I'm not sure if they are something like this or.
Yeah, in the innovation slides, the first slides, are there any graphs that you collected the results? I think the audience is asking for more.
Okay, from this plot.
I think that plot, yeah. Yeah, that one.
Yeah. No, not really. It's a bit difficult to gather that type of data. This is extracted from a book that talks about how innovations are spread. I don't remember it now, because we collected the image like a few months ago. But if anyone is interested, I can look for it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. And I think we can switch to the second one.
Yes, thank you very much, Hugo, for the nice talk. With this, we would
thank you.
introduce our second talk of the day. Then we can welcome from Queen's Hyperloop design team, Eunice, Aaron, Chen, and Thomas Zamin, who are socioeconomic researchers in the team, and they managed to bring back home the Socioeconomics Award of the European Hyperloop Week 2024 in Zurich. So with this said, guys, we're really looking forward to your talk. The stage is yours.
Yeah, for sure. Can everyone see our screen?
We can see the screen.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for that amazing introduction. Hi, I'm Eunice. And today we're here to present. We're with Queen's Hyperloop design team from Canada. And today we're here to present a multi-criteria approach for optimizing Hyperloop route planning. So going into a little bit of an introduction of kind of our project. So what were our key motivations going into this? So we identified three key motivations. The first one being utilizing existing research. We wanted to ensure that we could evaluate the key takeaways from previous research to guide an effective approach and to ensure that we're building on top of knowledge that's already been discovered. The second one is that we wanted to ensure that we are optimizing the route planning process as well as the route itself. So this involved using gathered data and creating a general framework to automate the overall planning process. And the final motivation was to understand the cost comparison. So not only looking at initial costs of constructions, but also looking at costs of sustainability, as well as other socioeconomic costs that could be incurred throughout this process. So what is our overall problem? The overall problem is while the realization of Hyperloop technology and the hardware advances year after year, the implementation process continues to be inefficient and hinder the future of green transportation. The spatial planning problem involves various economic, environmental, and social impacts that involve also multiple stakeholders. What is our ask? What are the key spatial planning factors that need to be addressed for successful implementation? And how can we validate this using existing research? So hi, I'm Eunice, and today I'm here with Thomas Zamin and Aaron Chen from Queen's University. And we're here to talk about kind of our approach and our framework that we've discovered to kind of optimize this route planning process. There are four big areas of our background knowledge. The first one being that we really prioritize collaboration. We ensured that we were consulting various research papers as well as discussing with various academic professors at Queen's University to kind of help identify the needs for Hyperloop to become a reality. The second one is software. We use Python, spatial data management, specifically FME, as well as GIS software to kind of make the framework and ensure that it's backed by socioeconomic data. We use the least cost path algorithms, including Dijkstra's algorithm and A-star. And finally, we had a few assumptions that we put in place since the data is gathered from diverse sources, and we are assuming that they have negligible bias throughout the entire process. I'll pass it off to Aaron to talk a little bit more about our methodology.
Thank you, Eunice. So as we started visualizing this problem, we first started off by dividing this overall into three main buckets. The three main categories that comprise socioeconomic considerations. So the most obvious one was definitely geographical, just thinking about the terrain, thinking about the landscape, thinking about the feasibility of where you could construct a Hyperloop route safely. And then another one was demographic. And on demographics specifically, we were very focused on adhering to labor market flows and also positioning which economic hubs would make the most sense as terminals within Canada. And airports is definitely a big one, which we'll be talking about later. And another one was infrastructure. This is more interconnected. This is more so about complementing existing infrastructure, such as other more modes of transportation, and figuring out if people were to use this Hyperloop system, how would they be able to seamlessly transition into another transit system. And overall, our strategic objective was just to thinking about all the key spatial and socioeconomic factors, we were able to make a general framework for a pathfinding framework that was viable financially and also sustainable. And for the specifics and the data sets, I'll pass it on to Thomas to talk more about that.
Yeah, so as Aaron mentioned, given the key considerations, we can start gathering data which can influence our route decision-making process. So in order to gather this criteria, we laid down some success criteria, which each data set has to meet in order for it to be considered. And this includes, it has to be geographically referenceable. So it has to be associated to some kind of map, just so it's quantifiable for the algorithm. It's obviously focusing on the area surrounding Hyperloop. It has to be open source. So any information that is free on the web, this helps prevent bias. And it also has to be unique. So if there's any types of criteria that have some form of overlap that could affect our overall route negatively. So we want to limit that. And some universal criteria for that could influence any sort of route includes terrain elevation. So obviously it makes sense to avoid any increase in elevation if possible, just to limit infrastructure costs, protected land, So we don't want to go through any biodiversity zones, as that's obviously not ideal. Pre-existing infrastructure, so we don't want to go through buildings either. That's also pretty important to consider. Integration with existing transportation systems. So a lot of research backs that it makes more sense for Hyperloop networks to go alongside train networks or highway networks. So we want that to be reflected in our algorithm as well. And proximity to bodies of water. So does it make more sense for Hyperloop to go over lakes, over rivers, or go around them? This is all considered in our decision-making process. Yeah, so as I mentioned, from the criteria I previously listed, they're all universally applicable. So given any 2 points, the criteria I listed will have some kind of impact. But to determine the impact that it actually has, that will vary region to region. So we will be using the analytical hierarchy process, which is a decision-making method commonly used in transportation design to assess the various factors. And using this process, we managed to connect the framework criteria together. And I'll pass it along to Eunice to talk more about the framework.
Absolutely. And so, kind of starting off with our framework, we realized that using strategic choices, we could kind of influence different factors of our path in addition to the factors that Thomas has already discussed. And the first one of those big decisions is the endpoint location. So we've determined that there are 3 different kind of big key areas of consideration that need to be placed, and those being passenger experience, the economic feasibility, and environmental impact. The passenger experience of a Hyperloop, we want to ensure is kind of this has a seamless integration within current infrastructure. So the primary usage of the Hyperloop path system will determine its proximity to large metropolitan regions and the surrounding transportation systems. The second one being economic feasibility, we want to look at the construction and operational costs, both from the initial costs and as well as the cost to sustain this kind of infrastructure, as well as any subsidiaries that might vary from region to region that we could take advantage of. And the final one is environmental impact. There are certain land areas that will be affected by the Hyperloop region will vary in terms of things if they're protected land, if they have different geographical characteristics, and we want to ensure that we're optimizing this for the location of the endpoints. The key takeaway of this is that the start and endpoints can be strategically chosen to maximize the path utility while avoiding high cost areas and minimizing the disruption to local ecosystems. And so you might ask, how do we do this? So how we do this is with a cost surface integration. And so we took individually weighted layers of our desired region. Our first layer was our universal criteria, which included things like terrain elevation, bodies of water, and all of the other factors that Thomas has mentioned before. Then we move up into our socioeconomic criteria. These are things like passenger population, demographics of local regions, such as income, age, consumer preferences, which talks about whether or not consumers actually care about green energy and sustainability, as well as other systems and utilities. And finally, we have our specialized criteria. These are unique criteria that don't apply to all regions and will vary heavily depending on which geographic location we choose, such as government regulations and other subsidies we can take advantage of. All of these individually weighted layers kind of come together to create a cost surface map, which is then inserted into Dijkstra's algorithm to produce the optimal path route. However, there's one more factor that we do need to consider, and that is the safety and wellness of our passengers during the Hyperloop ride. And so through external research that was conducted, we noticed that straighter paths are optimal for both the passenger experience, their safety, and operational costs, because straighter paths tend to be the shortest path between 2 points. However, that's not always possible with existing infrastructure and with existing kind of geographic characteristics. So we've determined that for a vehicle traveling at around speeds of 480 kilometers per hour, the minimum path curvature radius that is required for safety and wellness of passengers is 1.6 kilometers. As we scale that speed up to 1,220 kilometers per hour, we see that this radius increases in a very similar manner to 4.8 kilometers. So this radius is another factor that we need to integrate into our optimal path.
Yeah, and even more considerations that are taken into effect when creating this route is the Hyperloop pod in size. There's multiple different Hyperloop companies out there, each with their own design of Hyperloop pod and weight. So in order for this framework to be applicable to anyone, we need to consider the various shapes and sizes of the Hyperloop pods. Additionally, tube diameter. With each different pod, there's a different tunnel associated with it. So we have to consider the tube diameter and the material composition of those tubes, as well as passenger health and safety. So we want the overall route to be a smooth process for the passenger, and we want it to be an enjoyable process as well. And finally, system utilization and allocation of resources. So is the Hyperloop routes transporting people? Are they transporting cargo? This is all taken into consideration when creating our routes. So yeah, due to the nature of our design, our pathfinding algorithm framework allows each of these features to be fully customizable, adjusting the path to consider input criteria. This allows companies to visualize and prototype various design criteria before fully allocating resources. So yeah, now that we've laid the groundwork for how our framework works, we can sort of test it out by looking at an Alberta case study, which evaluates Transpod's route connecting Edmonton and Calgary in Canada. So this was our step-by-step process on creating our Calgary-Edmonton route, starting off with gathering relevant criteria. So this is universal socioeconomic and specialized criteria that could influence the route decision-making process. Then we weighted each individual criteria using the analytical hierarchy process and appended each criteria to a cost surface map in order for it to be read by the least cost path algorithm. So once we apply the algorithm on top of the map, we got our optimal route and then validated it using the transpod route proposals to sort of assess our framework and see how it lines up with their proposals. And these are some examples of relevant criteria that we used. And there's the route on the right over top of the Alberta digital elevation model. And as I mentioned, some of the universal criteria we used is existing infrastructure for national parks and First Nation settlements, the transportation networks in Alberta, the surrounding landscapes, so biodiversity zones, as well as terrain elevation. And zooming in a little bit more into Calgary to see how well this algorithm actually worked, we see that it set out exactly what we wanted it to do. It optimizes ridership through endpoint location. We connected both the Calgary and Edmonton airports, as that is the most congested area in terms of passenger traffic. It also avoids key infrastructure. So instead of going through residential areas, it tries to avoid it. And it also integrates well with existing transportation networks. So as you can see near the top there, it follows along the highway, which actually connects Calgary and Edmonton through Red Deer. And I'll pass it off to Aaron to sort of further validate our model.
Thanks, Thomas. So in our analysis, what we did was that we compared 4 central routes that were proposed by Transpod as a Hyperloop expansion between Calgary and Edmonton. So I'm just going to go into each of these and compare their unique pros and cons. So starting with the first central route, it was the highest in rectilinearity, which means that we get to reduce negotiations with landowners, which is a very bureaucratic process. But the weakness is that it crosses over multiple highways and it does interfere with transportation infrastructure, which means that while we did reduce negotiations, one party, there's still another thing that is more difficult to overcome. And then when we look at the second central route, it was the maximum broad curvature route, which means it's the shortest distance between Calgary and Edmonton. But then at the same time, it comes with a price of a high number of property crossings, which means a higher property risk. So again, that was not the most ideal outcome, despite being the shortest. And then when we look at the third central route, it travels through Red Deer at a greater angle, which is more convenient to be positioned as like a midway stop. But then that also comes with a greater distance, which means a longer travel time. So again, it was not the most ideal route to plan. And then when we look at the fourth central route, which was kind of constructed as like a compromise between the earlier 3 central routes, we found that it was balanced overall, but the weakness was that it did not consider the population flows of Red Deer. And overall, we found that these 4 central routes, it had some unique strength, but then that strength came with a sacrifice of something else. So then we decided that there had to be a different way to position the route so that it would be more accounting of all outcomes. And into that analysis, I'll pass that on to Eunice to talk more about that.
Yes, absolutely. So taking those 4 routes that Aaron just described, and we put them into what we call a weighted evaluation matrix. And so there are 3 kind of key steps. The first one being criteria. So looking at and polling, what do people actually care about? What are things that we as passengers would care about? And also what would companies who are implementing this would care about? And we came up with 4 kind of major criteria: financial viability, technical viability, transport compatibility, and landscape compatibility. We then scored all 4 of these routes and our own route against these 4 criteria. And then notice that our final result, the GIS MCDA, actually compared quite closely to CRT4, which validates the overall framework that we've gone through. Looking more and diving deeper into our results, we can see that the Hyperloop pathfinding application, we kind of divided into 2 of insights and analysis. The insights that we got were that the application of a pathfinding algorithm can be used to maximize the cost to functionality ratio, which is what everyone strives for, and the importance of high quality and accessible data sets to be able to use and to build and train a model. From that, we are able to do a little bit of analysis, looking at how the final framework isn't comprehensive of niche criteria, which is what we wanted in the end to be universally applicable. And the assumptions that were made based on the publicly available information was done to ensure alignment with current systems. Overall, the pathfinding algorithm creates a new area of exploration to optimize and streamline the process of building a Hyperloop system, and allows for the seamless integration with existing infrastructure and the conservation of resources. So now that we've done all this, what's next? And so we've identified 3 areas that we want to kind of explore a little bit more. The first one is expansion of capability. So further developing this framework to allow for a creation of a complex network of Hyperloop systems, looking at maybe connecting more than 2 points at once, or how the connection of 2 points can influence another, as well as looking at additional features that could allow for even more optimization of Hyperloop systems, such as timing and scheduling capabilities. We're also looking to partner with land surveying companies in the regions that are interested to gain access to up-to-date spatial data sets that will ensure accuracy of the model. And finally, as more emerging technologies continue to be explored, and we can use those to optimize and streamline the framework with more computational power, and as complexities increase around the world. So we want to say a huge thank you to everyone for coming and listening, and we're happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to listen to you. Yes, questions. How does the framework handle terrain obstacles like mountains or pre-existing infrastructure in route optimization? How did you handle?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit about that. So depending on the criteria, so let's just take existing infrastructure, for example. We gathered a data set, which is just a map of all the buildings in Alberta, and each pixel which contains a building or part of a building, or just a geographic coordinate which has some sort of infrastructure, we gave a value to that pixel, and from the algorithm would be able to then tell, okay, this, I do not want to go in this direction, so based on the value that that pixel has. So by having a least cost path algorithm, it'll generally move towards the area which has which is more desirable. And this applies to all criteria. So if there's an increase in elevation, then the value that that pixel has will slowly increase over, or the values that that general area of pixels will have will increase over time depending on the elevation at that certain point. If it's a biodiversity zone, then that will also have a relatively higher weighting as well. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Answers. Does the framework select the distance at each point? In that case, is the acceleration of the pod selected at the beginning?
Yeah, for sure. So we don't actually have that very specific piece of criteria in our framework because we understand we've talked to quite a few different companies who are trying to implement Hyperloop, and all of them have different designs in mind for the end-to-end stations, as well as how much distance they need to accelerate and decelerate their pod, as well as potential vacuum sealing. So that isn't necessarily a factor integrated within the framework, but is a customization that each individual company who wants to implement the Hyperloop can add on to themselves, and kind of the path will adapt as needed.
Okay, thanks. The next question, how does your study differentiate from the one of transport? Because transport also has a similar study.
Yeah, so we evaluated our I'm not too sure on how Transpod came up with their routes. They for each different route proposal, they prioritize different different things, whether it's having the straightest path or the most, I guess, the most beneficial to the terrain around it. But by having our framework, we were able to compare it to Transpod's proposal to see how they differ. And from there, we could sort of assess the feasibility of our framework and see how well it performs given any 2 points.
Okay, thank you. The next one, there are a lot of questions. What specific challenges did you encounter in the road plan of this site? What are the
Yeah.
major challenges?
One of the key things, which was a pretty big issue throughout the year, was just the sheer amount of data that we needed to handle, because we're considering the entire digital elevation model of the area surrounding those 2 points. And Hyperloop, we want it to travel very far distance, so there's a lot of data that it needs to consider. So just handling all of that was a very big issue, and eventually we came to the analytical hierarchy process, which allowed us to analyze each criteria individually and then append it all together. So instead of handling everything all at once, we could sort of split it off into smaller subsections and then combine it all together in the end.
Okay, we have one last question. Does this only apply to Canada geography now? How difficult is this model to take to different continents and regions? Does this current model optimize for construction costs? You mentioned labor markets. Does this model factor in labor market impacts?
Yeah, for sure. So that's the beauty of this framework. So we tested it on Canada, and as Thomas mentioned, we kind of used Transpod as a case to validate the framework itself. But our framework in this kind of process can actually be used anywhere around the world. So it can be without any modifications. You can put in a new data set of any country, any continent, and it will kind of do the same thing. And that's why we wanted to create this generalized framework. As for the labor markets, so within kind of the socioeconomic and on that second layer of that pyramid, we look at, the socioeconomic criteria and the data surrounding. That includes things like income levels, but it also includes things of labor markets, as you mentioned. So not only looking at people who would use this to go to and from work, but also people who might be able to work on the construction and the materials of importing and exporting that might be needed within the construction process. So it optimizes and does consider all of those external factors as well.
Perfect, sounds great. And I think we finished the questions. Thank you very much, guys. It was really so good to listen to your presentation, and I'm impressed by your work.
And also the time since to connect remotely from Canada, we really appreciate that. With this said, we are also over for this today's session. Next week, we will have more talks. Same time, 18th of November from 6 to 7 p.m. CET. And the next talks will be targeting the cooling system of Hyperloop vehicles. We will have an interesting talk about a report also submitted from the Swiss Loop guys at the European Hyperloop Week in Zurich, and then an expert talk from Hard Hyperloop on their cooling system they recently unveiled together with their vehicle in the Netherlands. So stay tuned, and next week we will continue the seminars.